morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Jenny Noonan-Dye, and you are participating and listening to this week's Come Follow Me lesson with the Mormon News Report podcast. I'm joining you today from Provo, Utah, alongside my husband, John Dye. He's the one who's responsible for everything that you're seeing on your screen. The Come Follow Me, a banner at the bottom or a banner at the top, or when we change to a different slide or a picture, he's the one who's doing that for us. As always, for those of you who are participating in real time here on our video stream, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you right now? Where are you watching from? What stood out to you in your study this week? Whether it was the first time or the 50th time you've read these verses, or you know what, even if you didn't study at all, we are glad that you're here, and we still want to hear from you and know where you are. We get to as many comments as we can, just as we would if we were all gathered together in person. We like to try to use this space and time as a supplement to your other Come Follow Me studies, to sometimes take a deeper dive into at least one aspect of the lesson that stands out. We love having your participation and your feedback. Are we on? Good? Okay, good. I'd like to excuse my co-host for the Mormon News Report podcast, Brant Malone in Detroit. You know what? He's got so much going on. Thank you to everyone who is a regular listener of our podcast for being patient. We will get to you soon to let you know what's happening there. And welcome our, shall I say, deep dive instructor. Are you a diving instructor? Ben? Ben Bernard. Yes, Ben Bernard from California. Thank you for being with us, Ben. Good morning.
Cheers. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Mormon News Report Hour of Power as we get into our AP Doctrine and Covenants little discussion of our Come Follow Me, our Sunday school class, giving you, hopefully, like Jenny said, another layer of perspective. We're the post-game victory root beer float after your football team finally won their kickoff game, inaugural game in Las Vegas.
Oh, okay. That was specific. That's good. Today is Sunday, September 5th, year of our Lord 2021. And our lesson today is called For the Salvation of Zion, and it covers Doctrine and Covenants, sections 94 through 97. Some brief sections as sections go, I guess. But Ben, I know that you've got a lot to cover in these, so we'll go ahead and get into that as soon as we say hello to our friends here. For Dave Bull in the UK, Pamela also in the UK, Randall in Heber, Utah, and Marie also in the UK. So good.
Wonderful. Our good friends from across the pond. We hope you are all doing well, and thank you so much for joining. You know, the sections, like Jenny mentioned, they're kind of short, you know, and sometimes that happens with the Come Follow Me lessons. You'll get one or two or three sections, and maybe the verses are more historical in nature, or maybe they're kind of administrative, like these verses were like, hey, you guys got to go build a temple. Yeah. And that's the high level overall theme of today's discussion, is just temples in general. Because there are a couple of verses that get in there that talk about the importance of a temple. Says you will go and you should be endowed in power. Like right now we're looking, this is the Mount Timpanogos temple. This one is near and dear to my heart. This was built in the little town of American Fork, Utah, just a few miles away from where I grew up. And when I grew up, this was empty farmland. And my high school was right next to this. So every day my bus would go past the construction site and we'd go and see it. When I was in high school, we got permission as part of the seminary council to go visit the site while it was under construction. Wow. And got a tour of everything that was there. And then our Stake Young Men's had a little program where they encouraged us to write our names on slips of paper with our testimonies. And all of those slips of paper were placed in a box that were sealed in the cornerstone of the Timpanogos temple. So my name is literally inside that building. And then later on, we got to participate in the dedication, and then I was endowed there, and then my sweetheart became my wife in that building. So that's a special one for me. I love it. How about you, Jenny? Do you have a favorite temple or one that's particularly significant to you?
I do indeed, and it is this one right here. Nice photography. Credit Scott Jarvie. That is the Provo City Center Temple, aka the Temple Neckle or the Provo Hipster Temple. Provo is one of a few cities which has more than one temple. And as you may recall, Provo used to have downtown a a tabernacle. And then in December of 13, maybe not.
Sounds about right.
It caught on fire, and the as much as was able to be salvaged structurally was, and then it, as they say, rose like a phoenix from the flames and became a temple. And that is the temple where my sweetheart became my husband. There it is.
Oh,
March.
Look at that.
Yeah, 2017. So that's that.
So cute. Wonderful. Also, welcome Sally from Las Vegas, Nevada, and Darlington from Liberia, West Africa. We're so glad to have you here.
Welcome.
So talking a little bit more about temples. I mean, that's the high level overall theme, and it's interesting because when you get into these verses, it says that the early brethren were chastised. They received the commandment to start building a temple in Kirtland, and they didn't start doing it right away. And a few verses later, they recorded God kind of yelling at them saying, yo, you should have started right away. Like, this is serious. This was a big deal. You should have done this. And every time I read that, I always thought, it's so obvious. We know that temples are important. Why didn't they start this? Didn't they know that it was a big deal? And especially nowadays in the 21st century, where temples have become like the icon of the Latter-day Saint faith, right? I mean, the iconography is on everything. We put it on our choir posters. We put it on little tiny medallions. We put it on postcards. If you drive up and down in Utah, it's on billboards on temple, all up and down the freeway. You go to the Salt Lake City International Airport, which is not run by the church, and yet there are posters that have come visit the temple in downtown Salt Lake City. So it's easy for us to kind of take for granted our current understanding of temples and how they work and what they do and what happens inside it. And then to use this present day lens and try to look back through the past to understand what happened back then and say, oh, come on, you guys, it's so obvious. Temples are important. You totally should have built a temple. Now, also on the inside, what happens inside a temple has changed over time. The ceremonies that we have right now are not word for word or exactly like they were done when Joseph Smith introduced them. And in fact, Joseph Smith himself saw the development and understanding of temple ceremonies. We say in the gospel that our understanding grows line upon line and precept on precept. And we say that God, we believe all that he has revealed and that he will yet reveal many great and important things. So it's this idea of a true and living church, a true and living understanding of the gospel, a true and living understanding that things are going to be gradually built upon and things are going to change over time. So we need to find ways to be comfortable with that. And what I hope to do today is to set a little bit of a broader historical and kind of cultural foundation of what the temples were and how it got started. And if you've already been through the temple, this might open your eyes a little bit onto some new understanding of what you've seen. And if you haven't been through the temple, this may open your eyes a little bit, some new understanding of what you might see on the inside. We're not going to get into anything that we are not allowed to talk about, but we'll probably share a couple things that you may not have heard before. Yeah. Okay, that sound okay, Jen?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. So strap on your flippers, tighten your diving mask. We're going deep. So the story begins not in Kirtland, Ohio. It begins centuries ago, clear back to the Old Testament. And this is one of the key things about understanding our Latter-day Saint temple worship. It is not founded or grounded in modern day Christianity. It has its roots clear back to pre-Christian Judeo ceremonies and understanding the relationship between Yahweh, Jehovah, God, and the house of Israel. In the very beginning, after escaping Egypt, after wandering through the wilderness to Sinai, Moses brings the house of Israel to the wilderness around a mountain, and he goes up into the mountain. And while he is there, Yahweh reveals his face. He reveals his name. He establishes a covenant with Moses and the house of Israel. He gave the 10 Commandments, which were later removed and replaced with the law of Moses. This is the founding story. This is the origin myth of Judaism. This is where it all begins for them. Now, some calendars will put it several thousand years before Christ. We don't know exactly when, but it was a long time ago. But this is the beginning of the timeline. All right. Now, that is also a literal thing. That's where the calendar literally begins, because as part of this Mosaic law, they received instructions to hold certain days as holy, a holy day that would happen on a particular basis. Every 7 days was a Sabbath. Let's go ahead and go to the next one, John. Every 7 days was a Sabbath, and then they would have special holidays after that. Because 7, according to the ancient belief, not only just for the Jews, but very common in the Mediterranean era, 7 was a sacred number of perfection and completion and holiness. Anything that got slapped with a label 7 was automatically considered holy. And if you wanted to say how good you were, how holy you were, you said, oh, well, I said this particular prayer 7 times, and therefore the seventh one, that was the one that went straight to heaven. Or, oh, that I was born on the 7th day. This baby was born on the Sabbath, which must mean he's going to be perfect.
Like me.
Now, there you go. Another interesting thing that they would do in the olden days was sometimes in their both spoken and written word, since numbers didn't always mean numbers. Numbers usually had a symbolic meaning, and 7 is one of them. They could actually take numbers and manipulate them, add them to each other, multiply them by each other. And by doing so, it would add to the meaning or multiply the meaning. So in this case, if 7 is sacred, then if you have 7 sevens, well, then that's the most sacred. That's the most perfect. That's the most holy that you could possibly have.
Huh.
Okay. You with me so far?
Yeah. Where do 3 sevens? I mean, if someone, let's say hypothetically, were born on the 7th day of a month in 1977,
okay,
that would be what? Mediocre? Like okay.
No, I mean that's pretty good. So
okay,
3 was the ancient symbol of the Trinity, which represented unity. And the God, it's the symbol of our in Christianity, it's what we understand to be the Godhead.
Perfect.
So if you would do 3 and 7 together, then it's a perfect unity of the Godhead, which is most holy. Excellent. I think it gives you a free pass for like extra brownies, and you don't have to do any chores.
Oh, okay, good. I like that.
So blackjack, are we playing blackjack? Is that what?
Bam.
Right.
Okay.
So 7 sevens is the most perfect. That's the most ideal.
7 sevens is the most perfect. Okay.
So
now, since they would have every 7 days was a Sabbath, one of the specific holidays that they were instructed to remember was the commemoration of when life began for them. Because, for us, we say New Year's Day is the day of new beginning. And psychology shows that when there is some sort of a calendar-based new beginning, we are more likely to feel committed to starting something over again. So the day that they received the law was a good thing. 7 Sabbaths after that was also a good thing, because they say, okay, we've now had a holy period of holiness. Now we've finished loading up the app. We're going to launch it for the first time, and we're going to get started. Go ahead and go to the next one, John. Which means on the first day after the 7th Sabbath, they would have a special feast called the Feast of Shavuot. This was the sacred beginning of a new era. So 49 days plus the 1 takes you to 50. In Greek, the word for 50 is Pentekosta. That's literally the word for 50. So the original Hebrew Bible would talk about the first day after the 7th Sabbath. They just called it the Feast of Shavuot. That got translated into Greek, which would say the 50th day or the Pentecosta day. The Greek New Testament got translated into English, and some of the Greek words stuck. Instead of calling it the 50th day, they simply called it the Pentecostal day, because the original audience understood the Greek and they kept the Greek in there. So when you see the word Pentecost, it just means 50. And that's why this was very significant for them. So for the Feast of Shavuot, they would get friends and family together. It was kind of like breaking the fast. If your ward has ever done that, it's kind of like a linger longer, but they'd have this really big church ceremony, and it was considered a sacred day. This was a new beginning for them. So no matter what was going on, if you were a good Jewish family, you would always gather together to recognize that God is going to be with you in this new beginning, this new era that you're going to celebrate on the first day after the seventh Sabbath, after the beginning of the founding of your year. Okay? Makes sense so far?
Yes. And it's, so when you say the beginning of the founding of your year, are you talking about whatever calendar beginning that might be, as opposed to every 50 days?
Correct. Yeah, this was not every single 50 days. So
Right.
Revelation on Sinai, they would say they traditionally aligned that with Passover.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the Feast of Shavuot, nowadays in modern Judaism, both traditional and Reformed, Shavuot is celebrated 50 days after Passover.
Got it. Cool.
So there's still people that do it today, and they'd get together like, okay, it's Shavuot, you get all the family, you make the yummy, wonderful bread, you've got all the food. It's a great thing. Okay, so that's Shavuot. That's the Pentecostal thing. Now, part of the reason that they did this was because their understanding of how God worked was slightly different than the other religions and the other faith traditions around them. When Yahweh came down and said, there will be no other gods before me, that was not him saying other gods didn't exist or other gods were fake or whatever. That was him acknowledging to the people that at that time, humans' understanding of the world was based on a plurality of different types of deities. The Egyptians had their gods. The Hellenes had their gods. The Babylonians had theirs. The Akkadians had theirs. All those others are out there. And in the middle of this, Yahweh says, look, I want to be your primary number one deity. I want you to trust me. I want you to come to me. I want you to believe that I am the one that's leading you and guiding you. Don't have, of all of the other mascots that are out there, don't have anybody else more important than me. So when he says, thou shalt have no other God before me, that's what he's saying. And their understanding with this is they're not supposed to have any carvings or graven images of Jehovah. But he didn't want to leave them in the darkness, both figuratively and literally. So one of the beautiful elements of their time in the wilderness was these pillars of fire that would spontaneously appear over the top of the tabernacle while they were wandering. It didn't happen every night. It seemed to coincide with holidays and special feasts. But that was a symbol to everybody that was out there, including the people on the absolute fringes, including people outside the house of Israel. They could see that God was with them, that God was over the tabernacle, and that the Levites and the priests that had permission to go into the tabernacle, because it was only a very small percentage that could go in, they were actually being blessed by the presence of God. And therefore, when they came out of the tabernacle and they gave instructions, you could trust them, because God had been with them and he revealed to them where they were supposed to go next and what they were supposed to do. And they recited the law, and you trusted that you were on the right path. Okay. So yeah, that's the one of the history things. Now let's go back to the disciples. So now centuries have passed. All of this tradition of people wandering the wilderness has gone on. We now come up to Christ's day. And Jesus comes out and he teaches a new law, a higher law. And in Luke 24, in verse 49, he says, behold, I send the promise of my Father upon you. Now, this is Jesus speaking after he's been resurrected. And he says to his disciples, tarry ye in the city of Jerusalem until you be endowed with power from on high. And this is the first time that word endow appears in the New Testament, one of the only times that it appears. Now, he says, you shall be endowed with power from on high. And if that doesn't make a ton of sense to the people that are there, because he doesn't say how long they have to wait or what they're supposed to do or what this endowment would look like. So he leaves the disciples and their wives and their families continue going about their day-to-day business, which included following the Jewish calendar of the high holy days and the feasts. And one of them coming up, since Jesus was slain on the Passover, 49 days later, we are going to have Shavuot again. So what happened? People were gathered together celebrating this feast. And now we pick up the story in Acts chapter 2, verse 1. Jenny, could you read a few verses for me there, please?
Sure.
Let's go 1 through 4.
Yeah,
Acts 2, chapter 1.
And when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Ghost, and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance.
Now, I'll skip down a little bit. So some of the other stories, Peter at that time spoke to part of the crowd that would have been assembled for this big feast. Some of them would have been Jesus's disciples. Some of them would have been the 12, or at this point, the 11 apostles, and their wives, and their servants, and some people that were possibly what they would call Gentiles, right? They weren't Jews, but they were still believers. And he gave them this prophecy. He said, "It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out of my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaidens I will pour out in those days of my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. And the sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Okay, so before we go any further, how is this related to what we talked about with the Old Testament stuff with the tabernacle? Do you see any comparisons or contrasts here?
So in the part that you had me read, the part about the fire appearing above them. Yeah, that's what I got from it.
So what's significant about that? Why did that stand out?
Oh, just because when you were talking about a pillar of fire, I didn't know that. I didn't know what you just taught us about when they were in the wilderness and that pillar of fire, because we hear that every now and then. And you know, I joked about the Provo City Center temple being the Provo hipster temple, but there is another temple in Provo, and it is near Rock Canyon and right across the street from the Missionary Training Center. And I've heard it described as kind of when it's lit up at night, because there's a round base and then a spire that goes straight up. And I've heard that described as a pillar of fire. And so that it would resemble such. And so that's what
back in the old days, especially back in the old days when it used to be painted gold instead of the white that it is now.
Right. Yes, exactly. So yeah, so that's what's kind of in my mind.
Oh, that's great. So notice that in the old days, in early Judaism, that God appearing as a pillar of fire, signifying to the people that he was with the tribe of Israel, only happened over the tabernacle. And only the priests on the inside got that pillar of fire. Now, on this day of Pentecost, who did that fire land on?
Yeah, everyone that was there, right?
Everyone. All the men, all the women, the servants, all the people, everybody that was there gathered together. So what does that mean? What can we infer from this? What do you think?
I don't know. John Dyer,
so,
do you think? Anyone?
John, what do you think? Or anybody in the class?
Well, just the fact that, literally he wanted to endow us with power, right? He needed a place where he could do that. We had to create a temple, the Kirtland temple, where that could be done. Traditionally, as you mentioned in the Old Testament, pillar of fire meant his presence was there. It signified learning. It signified, helping people garner the knowledge and the wisdom that they needed to be more like Heavenly Father and our heavenly parents. And similarly, the day of Pentecost, his spirit was given to everyone. Obviously, his presence was felt, and that needed to be done at Kirtland as well.
Yeah, no, good job. So I think it's significant to note that for centuries, one of the hallmarks of Judaism was the sense of division between the sacred and the profane. That there is a physical barrier to remind you of what is holy and what is not. And there were multiple barriers, right? You've got the outside of the whole camp, and then you've got the walls around the tabernacle, and then inside is the inner court, and then inside is the holy place. And there's a physical veil that you had to walk through to get into the Holy of Holies. And with that physical barrier was a filtering that takes place. Every time you walk through, fewer and fewer people were allowed to get in. Until it got all the way down to the Holy of Holies, at which point only the high priest was allowed to pass through the veil to enter into the presence of God. So that means women could not go into the tabernacle. Children couldn't go in. Any non-Jews could not go in. And of the Jews that were there, only 1/12 of them, tribal-wise, only the member of the house of Levi could go in. And then in the house of Levi, there were so many of them, they had to cast lots, like they'd pull dice out of a bag. And if your number came up, you were then allowed to go in. And only those people that went in, the pillar of fire came up above the tabernacle to say God is with them. So if you lived in that world, you would have seen God talking to everybody else, but not you. You would have seen God's presence helping out someone else, but you would have been an outsider. You wouldn't have been included. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't love you. It just meant that you would have to trust the person to whom he was talking. In the New Testament, that Pentecostal experience shifted. It blew that paradigm away. All of a sudden, all of these barriers between God and man have fallen. And this is part of the message of Christianity. This is the veil being rent when Jesus died. This is the stone being rolled away. This is now that God and his holiness are accessible to men and women and children and Jew and Gentile alike. And so on this Pentecostal day, part of it was a foundational change of who God is talking to, who he considers holy, and who gets to receive the blessing of all this stuff. And so now when we see this, we're like, oh, wow, this is now the symbol of God. Now, instead of God's presence being over the tabernacle and over the Jews, now God's presence could happen and land on anyone at any time. So in Joseph Smith's day, we're now going to fast forward a few centuries. In Joseph Smith's day, you had some Christians that still truly believed that you would have this tradition of authority, and authority would come through the papal church. And then you had the anti-papists that are like, nope, we don't believe that. And that's where people in Joseph's community believed. They said God's presence and spirit could come to anyone at any time. And once we find somebody with those spiritual gifts, that's where God must be. So now coming back a little bit to the New Testament, Jesus said that he would, quote, endow them with power from on high. Okay, that's the word that he used in Luke 24. We're going to get a little bit of some word nerdiness on here, digging into the etymology of what that word actually means. Go to the next one, please, John. So this word endow, it's a transliteration of a Greek word andoueste, which literally means to, the most basic definition is to sink into clothing or to put clothing around or on top of somebody else. But the context behind it, it was usually used talking about putting clothing upon someone else, but it was usually wealthy clothing. So in the Middle East, clothing was a status symbol. Nice clothing and robes were a sign of your wealth and your power and authority. You would give them to your firstborn child, like Joseph, like baby Jesus. Or a wealthy person could physically enrobe a beggar or a debtor, or they could wrap their robes around somebody, both physically transferring wealth and power and authority, and also symbolically telling everybody that's around them that's watching that ceremony happen, when I wrap you and I give you this embrace, I'm going to put something over, I'm going to literally cover your back. That is covering your past. That is what happened. And any debt that you had is now gone. And while you are wearing my robes, you are under my care, you're under my protection, you are part of my family, and I'm going to talk to you and give you the information that you need. This is the entire message of the prodigal son. One of my favorite pieces of art of all time is seeing how that wealthy father comes to his son and literally wraps his arms around him in that sacred loving embrace and says, I will cover your back and cover your sin.
I have a comment here from the Peanut Gallery. Yes. It's not from me. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, we always say, hey, I've got your back. It probably began here.
Brilliant. Love it. So this is one of the older meanings of this word endow, is you are putting wealthy clothing upon somebody else. Now, the next meaning that's a little bit more modern is talking about more on the monetary, less on the clothing side, but more on the physical monetary side. Go to the next one, please. This is to gift, to endow as a verb is to gift riches, but it has to be enough that it's intended to provide ongoing income. It's the passive residuals. It's the interest that's coming. This, if you recognize, especially for the some of our friends over in the UK, this is where a dowry would come from. This is what a dowager, like a person that has family members have died, but they are still living off the income because somebody else was very, very wealthy. The whole idea of an endowment in this sense, or a dowry, was related to family, to inheritance. This is something that is passed down from person to person because you had a close personal connection, but that gift that they give you is so significant that that gift by itself could provide ongoing riches and ongoing income. And nowadays, in the modern day, we use it. You hear it talking about like an endowment at a university. You know, somebody has given a huge tax write-off, give billions of dollars to a school or whatever. Okay, so that's what the word endowment is. So with that imagery, when Christ says, "I will endow you with power," what he said to his apostles and his disciples, we have this idea of a physical enrobing, him getting our back, him wrapping us up in this embrace. There's this element of symbolic or even possibly literal clothing. There's also this idea that he's giving it to us because it's a gift, but it's a very wealthy gift. And if we take that gift seriously, it can provide ongoing riches and ongoing gifts. And it's going to keep on giving more than just that one time. Okay, everybody with me so far? Makes sense?
Yep.
All right, let's go to the next one. Now, we get to Kirtland. We get to Ohio. In Doctrine and Covenants 38, they were instructed to gather to the Ohio. And there he says, "I will give unto you my law, and then you shall be endowed with power from on high." So you had this promise given to the early saints of something that was going to happen, some sort of spiritual endowment. And in their mind, they were thinking so frequently about a Pentecostal type experience. Sidney Rigdon and his Campbellite disciples in Kirtland, Ohio, repeatedly said and taught each other that they would recognize the hand of God when it came in the form of speaking in tongues, visions, miracles, some sort of outpouring of spiritual gifts. And in the early days of the church, we see the word endowment, and I'm going to call it endowment with a lowercase e, endowment in this context of a spiritual outpouring being talked about at the church organization when people were first confirmed in 1830. We see it again in 1831, being endowed by the Spirit and endowed when the high priesthood came. This was a Pentecostal outpouring. We see it again in the school of the prophets when they would speak in tongues. The idea was that if you prepared significantly mentally and emotionally and spiritually to focus on God, then you could have an outpouring of this physical spirit. All right, let's go to the next one, please, John. Here we would also see now something significant changed when this Kirtland temple, as John mentioned earlier, when a physical building was built. Joseph Smith says that he gathered the 12 together, that he instructed them to prepare their minds for an endowment of power from on high. To help them understand the significance of this, he anointed them with holy oil in token and remembrance of the Old Testament priests and Levites that also received a similar anointing. He also symbolically washed and literally washed their feet. Some of them thought it was kind of scandalous at the time to have one man sit there with an apron around his waist, just like Jesus did to his disciples. And he symbolically washed them, saying, we need to become clean. And if we do this, we can now also become endowed with power on high, to prepare whatever was going to happen. And they didn't know what this was going to be. This is completely unprecedented. So all the people that had both the disciples, and they went home and they told their wives about it, and they got together and they said, okay, we've built this building. We don't know why. And then some miraculous things happened. Here is a snippet of a story, just one of the dozens and dozens of extant journals that still persist today. Can you go to the next one, please? It's okay. We'll give it just a second for this slide to pop up. One of the men that we have is a man named William Draper. William Draper was a stalwart new convert. He was baptized at 23 years old, served missions to Canada. He was a merchant that lived in Ohio, went out to Missouri, came back to Nauvoo, stayed behind after the vanguard went to Salt Lake City, and he helped prepare the saints. And he was later a bishop, made it all the way across the plains, served in Nebraska, came all the way up to Utah. And just around Point of the Mountain, they've named the town of Draper after him. And one of the things that he writes in his autobiography was this simple story. Jen, would you mind reading that for us, please?
Happy to. And there in the temple on the day of Pentecost of the 6th day of April, 1836, there was such a time of the outpouring of the Spirit of the Lord that my pen is inadequate to write it in full, or my tongue to express it. But I will here say that the Spirit was poured out and came like a mighty rushing wind and filled the house, that many that were present spoke in tongues and had visions and saw angels and prophesied, and had a general time of rejoicing such as had not been known in this generation.
That Pentecostal experience stayed with the early saints as this immense outpouring, and it was memorable for the rest of their lives. A young woman named Prescindia Huntington. Oh, I love that. Prescindia Huntington.
Mm-hmm.
She says, quote, on one occasion, I saw angels clothed in white walking upon the temple during one of our monthly fast meetings, like, hey, a fast Sunday. The saints were in the temple worshiping, and a little girl came to my door and in wonder called me out, exclaiming, the meeting is on top of the meeting house. And I went to the door and I saw on the temple angels clothed in white, covering the roof from end to end. They seemed to be walking to and fro, and they appeared and they disappeared. And the third time they appeared and disappeared before I realized they weren't mortal men. And each time in a moment they vanished and their reappearance was the same. And this was in broad daylight in the afternoon. And a number of children in Kirtland also reported seeing the same. That night, she goes on in her journal, and I will share links in the show notes and on our Facebook page for people reading this afterward. She then says in her journal, at another fast meeting, I was in the temple with my sister Zina, and the whole of the congregation were on their knees praying vocally. While the congregation was praying, we both heard from one corner of the room above our heads a choir of angels singing most beautifully, invisible to us. But myriads of angelic voices seemed to be united in singing some song of Zion, and the sweet harmony filled the temple of God. And there are several other stories like this where people reportedly spoke in tongues and other people interpreted the tongues. At one point, one person stood up and spontaneously started singing a song in an unknown language. And another person in the crowd, unrelated to them, stood up and right on beat, right on the downbeat, they started singing the exact same song in the same language, in harmony, multiple pieces, and then they wrapped it up and landed right on the downbeat, and they stopped and they sat down. And the rest of the crowd listened, and then one of the brethren stood up and says, you've been singing in the Adamic tongue.
Wow.
So we see in this modern day that this idea of a Pentecostal experience could happen and did happen at the Kirtland experience. And some of them would talk about this being endowed with power from on high. Now that was Kirtland. And the only ceremonies that took place is, we talked a little bit about anointing and washing of feet. That's roughly analogous to what we in the Latter-day Saints would call the initiatory, or washings and anointings. It's not exactly what we do today, but it was kind of a precursor to sort of set their mind. A decade later, after the struggles of Missouri, and after all the challenges of getting their feet under their ground in Nauvoo, we finally get to a place where we can set up a new temple. But Joseph knows he's running out of time. he had been given promptings, if not straight up warnings, that he would not be there to see the building finished. And he had so much more that he had to pour out to the people. So May 3rd, 1842, Joseph Smith, who was a shopkeep. They had a little red brick store next to his house. He and his wife would sell, whatever kind of merchandise they could. And in the attic of this shop, they had space where they would keep extra inventory. And it was a quiet, secure, private space where sometimes he would go and talk with the brethren and his wife, and sometimes he'd go and receive revelation. And up there, he invited 9 of his closest male friends for this very first time. And he says, I've got something I need to show you that I've been working on. And he pulled them up to the roof, and he had set out plants and a couple of curtains hanging from ropes. And he generally said, this is not finished, it's not polished, but I'm trying to help convey to your mind this idea of something. So I've got a little story to tell you. And there he gave them what was the first version of a ceremony that walked through the creation of the world and the Garden of Eden and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And there he introduced additional light and knowledge, including ceremonial clothing, sacred garments, and sacred knowledge that would then give them additional power from God, additional power from on high. Now, this was different than the Pentecostal type outpouring of spiritual gifts, but this huge gift of this additional ceremony is what would later be referred to as the endowment with a capital E. So this version of a Novu Endowment, some historians call it the Novu Endowment, after Joseph's death was repeated as the brethren that were there, they went back. So Wilford Woodruff, Brigham Young, William Smith, several of the other counselors and members of the Quorum of the 12, they went back, and Wilford Woodruff especially wrote down in his notes everything that Joseph did. And when the saints went west, they had no building to go to, but he says, I need to write this ceremony down because once we have a new building, we need to set that ceremony in order. Now, later on, women were added to it throughout the year, and they only did it for live people. This was not done vicariously. It was only given this endowment of power and of knowledge because they believed that once you had this, you would then be given the power you needed to make through life and through the challenges that would come, bookended on one end by Nauvoo and Salt Lake City on the other. And so as you look back over that first generation of people that made it all the way across the plains, so many of them were that anchor bedrock generation, largely because they received this endowment that gave them a new perspective on what life was about. And it gave them additional spiritual and mental power to endure the challenges that came. So with that, now today in our modern day temples, we have this same endowment ceremony that has gone through minor grammatical changes over the years, but the core doctrine is still there. It has been pruned and refined and has been kind of distilled down to its core essence over time. And we see that that's kind of what happens with the doctrine, right? That our understanding is going to grow and going to evolve. And so with that, we now have a hopefully a better perspective on what endowment is and what it can mean and why God was trying to help them see why this was so significant. So before I go any further and close it up, let me pause right there. Jenny, any thoughts come to your mind? Anything stand out to you here, or do you have any questions or comments?
So what would you say, because I think it's kind of a really general thing that we hear when people say, well, endowment means a gift. And that's not untrue, but I mean, according to what we've been talking about here today, it's quite incomplete.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a gift, but it's more.
Yeah. There's so much more to it, right?
Yeah.
My wife has a ring that she wears on a finger. The ring has a rock in it. That ring cost me money, and it's on one of the 10 fingers of her hand. Now, to anybody that doesn't know anything about that ring, if I said my wife has a ring on her finger, they could say, okay, she has a ring on her finger, and that's about as deep as it gets. But when I look at that ring and I see the struggles that we've been through, the challenges that we have overcome, the time that we've invested in each other, the miracles that we have seen, the breadth and depth of the sorrow and the joy and the love, and the way that my life is permanently different and better because of her, all of that, those words only begin to approach the edges of how I truly feel about her. And that is somewhat encapsulated in the idea of a ring on a finger. And I don't think that is a message that even my kids will only truly understand. The only person that would really understand that is the person who has received that ring and who has been through it herself. And so when she and I look at that ring, we know what it means. And we try to impress upon the minds of the people around us how big of a deal that is. And sometimes they have to take it on trust. And then sometimes for my close friends and family, I might share a story or two of that. And then they understand why that ring is such a big deal. But yeah, to the outsider, it's a ring. I kind of wonder if that's sort of what the endowment and the temple ceremonies are for us. Yeah, it's a gift. It's a ceremony that we do. And if we haven't been through it and we don't understand it and we haven't spent time in it, it will seem like any other ceremony, kind of in the sense that the sacrament is just bread and water. But for those of us to whom it is a sacred thing, it's more than just bread and water. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That's a great analogy. Yeah.
So final thoughts here as we wrap this up. I believe that our heavenly parents really want us to understand them. God wants us to understand him, and we want to understand God. You know, one of our oldest foundational myths that has persisted through multiple cultures is this foundational myth of a great tower that men constructed to reach the heavens. In the Akkadian tongue, the native city was called Bab Elim. Bab is an old word that meant gate, and Elim was a term for God, lowercase g, God, like any God. So this Bab Elim, the city, literally meant the gate of God. And like the Babylonians that would live in this exact same place later on, and other Mediterraneans like the Greeks, the Akkadians, they believed that gods in all their form lived on mountaintops. That's where the storms were. That's where, you know, thunder and the lightning and everything, that was up at the top. The gods were up in the tops of the mountains, and they could grant powers and boons to humans if you could entice them down. And so they figured, well, what if I built an artificial mountain, something that was shaped and big like a mountain? Then maybe the god would come down here, and maybe on the top of that mountain, I would make a very nice little palace, and that's where the god would come down, and that's where he would want to live. They would want to come dwell. So they constructed mountains. In their language, it was called a ziggurat, or a big tower. And they hoped that if they climbed the top of that mountain, their artificial one, they could commune with the divine. Now, today for us, do we not do the same thing in our Latter-day Saint faith? Do we not also metaphorically go to the tops of our mountains? Do we not hike those stairs, climb that temple hill to commune with the divine? Because we seek to reach that knowledge that is not spoken of in public. We seek to commune with God in that sacred embrace as they wrap us figuratively and literally in sacred cloth that is so much more than just cloth. And if we do that, if we can hike to that top of the mountain to get closer to that God, and we then have that celestial viewpoint, then maybe our timeline of everything that's around us can fall into a new perspective. The challenges that previously had been looming huge might not be so big after all. Because the temple then is not the end of the journey. It's not the final checkbox on a spiritual to-do list. It's supposed to be the beginning. That's the first step on a new life. So the question then is not whether we have been to the temple, but whether that temple experience has been through us.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm really appreciative of that detail and history on not necessarily the endowment, like you say, capital E, but endowment also in general. Thank you for that, Ben. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah, there's nothing I can say to make that better. Thanks again to everyone who joined us. I know we had some other people join who let us know, Ken in Alabama and Tony, who we know is in the UK. So thank you all for letting us know that you're here. We will be back again next week around the same time. We begin Mountain Time between 9 and 9:20 a.m. And next week's lesson is called Be Still and Know That I Am God. And it covers Doctrine and Covenants, sections 98 through 101. So thanks again to Ben for all this detail and preparation. We are all the better for it. So thank you very much, Ben. We appreciate that. Thank you to John Dye for being on top of it with preloading those slides and showing what Ben needs to be shown to give his lesson. And yeah, again, we will be back next week, and we're gonna, I think, go out again with another video like we did last week.
Yeah.
So take care, everyone. Have a wonderful week, and we will talk with you again soon.
It's June 1833, and the Lord deals a stinging rebuke in Kirtland. Thus saith the Lord unto whom I love, You have not considered the great commandment that I have given concerning the building of my house, in which I designed to endow you with power from on high. Immediately, Hiram Smith and Reynolds Cahoon went out, grabbed shovels, and started digging the foundation, while George A. Smith went to the quarry and loaded the first stones to be used in the temple construction. Sometimes we just need to grab a shovel and start digging. Temples are a major part of the restoration. However, the early saints didn't yet know how important temple blessings were, even though they'd already been commanded to build 2 temples. In Kirtland, the land had been purchased in March, but building hadn't started yet. And in Zion, or Missouri, Joseph Smith had laid the cornerstone nearly 2 years earlier, but nothing else had been done. The Lord needed to restore His keys and powers and gifts through His temples, and promised that if the saints built them, I will multiply a multiplicity of blessings upon you and your generations forever and ever. Wow! Unfortunately, their daily troubles caused them to lose focus on the temple. That never happens to us, right? Now, there were 2 problems keeping the Kirtland saints from starting a temple. The first was the same thing that always plagued the early saints: lack of money. They were still learning that as we sacrifice and are completely obedient, the Lord makes up the difference. The other problem was they had no idea how to build it. Most of them lived in crude log cabins, and the idea of building a temple was mind-boggling. Finally, in June, the 3 members of the First Presidency humbled themselves and knelt in prayer to ask the Lord for help in designing and building the temple. As they prayed, a vision of the temple appeared as if it was already built, and they were touring it. Hey, this is centuries before virtual tours were a thing. Examining its exterior, they observed the structure of the windows, roof, and steeple. The temple then inexplicably moved over the top of them, and they found themselves inside it, inspecting its interior walls. Immediately after their vision ended, they drew up the plans for the temple. Now, while the saints in Kirtland were starting to build the temple, things weren't going well for the Missouri saints, facing persecution and destruction. Violence erupted on July 20th as a mob of angry men stormed the Phelps home and printing press. They forced Sister Sally Phelps and her 5 children outside, where they huddled together and watched the mob destroy their furniture, possessions, and home along with the printing press. The mob then threw the precious pages of the Book of Commandments out the window. Luckily, Mary and Caroline Rollins and Sister Vienna Jakes were able to rescue some of these pages so that at least a few copies could be bound. Bishop Edward Partridge and Charles Allen were dragged to the main square to be tarred and feathered. Bishop Partridge desperately pleaded for the men to kill him and let the rest go. But the angry men were delirious with mob mentality, and many other saints were driven from their homes as personal belongings and farms were destroyed. Many elders were falsely accused and unjustly arrested. As the sheriff was moving them from the courthouse to the jail, several members of the mob surrounded them with guns. A few elders were able to escape safely, but Sidney Rigdon stood his ground. 2 mobsters menacingly came up to him, aimed their guns directly at his chest, and shot him. But nothing happened. Sidney quickly searched his body and found no injuries. One of the guns had broken, and the other misfired at close range. Yes, the Lord was helping them, even if it was hard for them to see at the time. Nevertheless, at gunpoint, the church leaders were forced to sign an agreement to leave Jackson County by early spring. But the violence quickly escalated to the point where the saints were forced to flee across the Missouri River in the middle of winter. But why did this happen? Well, while we definitely don't know all of the answers, we do know a few. Obviously, the biggest reason was that Satan was doing everything he could to keep the saints from establishing Zion and building a temple. He knows the power of temple blessings, so he fanned the flames of the non-Mormons' irritations into full-fledged hatred. Also, some of what W. Phelps printed in the church newspaper, the Evening and Morning Star, further troubled Missouri citizens. One article stated that freed slaves could be baptized and join the saints in Missouri. Ooh, this really angered the original settlers because Missouri was a slave state, and they didn't want freed slaves moving in, and they didn't want to lose their own slaves. Remember that whole Civil War thing on the horizon? Yeah. Furthermore, because of the large number of saints moving in, they'd soon be the major political voting power in the area, and the old settlers certainly needed enough votes to remain a slave state. And to be fair, some of these saints weren't always very kind and neighborly to those that didn't belong to the church. And unfortunately, since the saints hadn't started building the temple in Zion, they weren't enjoying the huge blessings associated with temples that the Lord had promised. Really, the importance the Lord placed on building his early temples can help us recognize how vitally important they are to us today, and may remind us that sometimes we just need to grab a shovel and start digging, or the car keys and start driving to the temple.